Okay, so today we are going to focus on section 1.7, which is simplifying expressions. And today we're basically going to focus on the introduction of our properties, our commutative, associative, and distributive properties. And then eventually that will help us lead to simplifying expressions and getting what we would know as an answer. And then eventually what we're going to look into in a different video will be the idea of adding and subtracting like terms and figuring out what like terms are. So our first two properties are properties of addition and multiplication. So basically what that means is that each property will work for addition and for multiplication. And so the first property that we come to is going to be our commutative property. And our commutative property means that we can add or multiply in any order. So basically with what we've been doing, we've learned, maybe you've kind of figured this out on your own, but then you can add or multiply in any order that you want, so long as it's only multiplication or addition. So the only thing that this will work for if it's all multiplication or all addition. Otherwise, it won't work and you'll end up getting the wrong answer. And so for addition, we have two different things here. And so we have kind of the general text is a plus b is equal to b plus a, meaning no matter what a is and b is, as long as they're the same, doesn't matter in which way that you order them, they're always going to be the same. So for example, what we have is we have 2 plus 4 is 6 is equal to 4 plus 2, which is also 6. So it doesn't matter the order in which we do that. Now the same thing is going to work for multiplication. So long as a and b are going to be the same thing, you can have a times b equaling b times a. So for example, 2 times 4 is 8, just like 4 times 2 is also 8. And so that's our commutative property, which allows us to add or multiply in any given order. Next up is our associative property. And with the associative property, what this allows us to do is this allows us to add or multiply groups of any numbers together. So again, what it's going to do is has to be all addition or multiplication. So we have to make sure that everything is addition or everything is multiplication, or it's not going to work. And so what this allows us to do is this allows us to use parentheses. And with these parentheses, we can create parentheses and create groups that are a little bit easier to add or multiply together. So let's take a look at some of these examples. So we have a plus b in parentheses plus c is equal to a plus in parentheses b plus c. Now remember, the order of operations tells us we have to do what's in parentheses first. So if we look at the actual example here, we have 2 plus 4, which is 6, plus 10 more, which gives us 16. And then we have 2 plus 4 plus 10. So we have to do what's in parentheses first. And so we get 2 plus 14. And then down here, we also end up getting 16. And so our answers are going to match up to what we need them to be. Now with the other example, with the multiplication, it works in the similar fashion. So we have a times b in parentheses times c is equal to a times b times c in parentheses. So if we follow that pattern, again, we have to do what's in parentheses first. So 2 times 8 or 2 times 4 is 8 times 10, which gives us 80. And that is equal to 2 times here, which is 4 times 10, which is 40, which is equal to 80 as well. So you can see it doesn't make a difference how we do this, how we arrange them, or how we group them. Our answers will still come out to be the same. So we have our commutative property, which allows us to move things around, and our associative property that allows us to change the groups of what we have. So in order to use these correctly, what we can do is we can use the associative or the commutative property basically in any order that we want to, as long as we're just kind of keeping things the same when we're not changing anything. And so what we can do is we can work some of these examples and we can think about what would be easier to solve mentally. And so we can think about the facts that we know that are a little bit easier to multiply. And right now I know that 4 and 25 are a little easier to multiply together after the fact. And so what we can do here is we can commute the 9 and the 25, and we can switch the order here. So we get 4 times 25 times 9. And then after I can do that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to associate these two things and group them together, and I get 100 times 9. And then I can multiply those together and I get 900. So what I can do with these properties, I can rearrange things so that they're a little bit easier to solve. Same thing with the addition problem. 25 and 75 are a little bit easier to add together. So I can commute those. So I can commute the 75 and the 48. So I get 25 plus 75 plus 48. And then what I can do is I can associate those two things by giving them parentheses. And then I get 100 plus 48, which gives me a total of 148. And that's how I use the associative and the commutative properties together with each other. And finally, we move on to the distributive property, which is kind of a little bit different than the associative property and our commutative property. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's look at what the distributive property actually is. So the distributive property is you multiply the number in front by each piece in the parentheses and keep whatever the sign is in the middle. And so we'll take a look at what this is as far as an example. And so what we're going to look at first is we're going to look at this example over here. This is the general example here. And so what we're doing is we're taking this value of a, because typically what we would say is we have to multiply this a by everything inside the parentheses, but what we need to do is we need to figure out what's inside these parentheses. Well, the problem lies in the fact that we might not know what those parentheses or what's inside those parentheses. We won't know what A is, we don't know what B is. And so what we need to do is we kind of need to do this creative process in which we call the distributive property. What we're going to do is we're going to take this A, multiply it by this B, and then multiply it by this C. And then so what we get as a result is we get A times B plus A times C. And so what we're doing is we're keeping this sign right here and carrying it over. So either way, B and C are still in a way getting added together, and then they're all getting multiplied by A. So let's look at this for an example here. And so if we don't kind of agree with whether this works or not, we get 3 times 4 plus 8, which is 12, which gives us an answer of 36. And if we do this part over here, we get 3 times 4, which is 12. And then we get 3 times 8, which is 24. And then we still get 36 as a result. And so no matter how we do this, the distributive property just helps us get around issues in which we're going to find out that we always don't know what number is in the parentheses because there'll be something else in there. And so what we'll find out is this property actually helps us use mental math to solve specific problems. And so what we can do is if we can have things be added together in parentheses, what we can also do is we can break them apart. And so what we can do is we can look at 15 times 103. And not very many people will know what 15 times 103 is. And so what we can do is we can use this kind of a reverse style of a distributive property and say this problem is also the same thing as 100 plus 3 in parentheses times 15. And then using the distributive property, I can multiply these two things together. So 15 times 100 and then plus 15 times 3. And then doing so, I get 1500 or 1500 plus 45, and then I get 1545 as a final answer. So instead of trying to figure out what 15 times 103 is, what I could also do is I could kind of break that apart into 100 plus 3 and then do 15 times 100 plus 15 times 3 to give me my answer. Now in a similar fashion, I can do this with 6 times 19, but I'm going to do this in a little bit different fashion. If I can use addition, I should be also able to use subtraction as well. And so I can write this as 6 times 20 minus 1. Now if you notice, I didn't change the problem because 20 minus 1 is still 19. So the problem never really changed. And so what I can do then is I can write 6 times 20 and then minus 6 times 1, because remember the rule of the distributive property is to keep the sign that's in the middle, and in this case it's subtraction. And so I get 6 times 20, which is 120, minus 6, and then I do 120 minus 6, which gives me 114 as my final answer. So there's my simplified answer. Now what I was referring to before is that sometimes we're not going to know what is inside the parentheses, so maybe we can't really do anything. And so this is a case where we have a variable x, which we don't know what that is. And so there's no way that we can add x plus 2 because we don't even know what x is. X could be basically anything. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to use the distributor property to take the 6 times x and then the 6 times the 2. So I can write this 6 times x plus 6 times 2. Well, 6 times x is still just 6 times x, or we can simply write that 6x, and then we can add 12 to that, because 6 times 2 is 12. Now in this case I can't really add anything here, because again I still don't know what x is, and I would have to know what x is before I figure out the rest of this problem. And so that's how we use our distributive property. And then so just to recap, remember our associative property allows us to add or multiply in any order. So we can do a plus b is equal to a or b plus a, and then a times b is equal to b times a. Our commutative property allows us to change grouping, so we could have a plus b in parentheses plus c is equal to a plus b plus c in parentheses, and that also works for multiplication. And so a times b in parentheses is the same as, or a times b in parentheses times c is the same thing as a times b times c in parentheses. And then our distributive property is kind of the combination of addition and multiplication, which we can't really do anything with. And so if we have an a on the outside of a b plus c, that gives us a times b plus a times c. And that's going to do it for this part of today's lesson.